All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to today's web seminar, Farm Energy Management. We're going to be talking about the impact of peak demand on farm electricity costs. Our last web seminar was on the impact of energy costs on farm energy costs. And so we're kind of walking through a three-part series talking about energy costs, demand costs, and then we're going to follow up next week with power factor costs. And so that's going to be the one that's going to get a little more technical. The power factor is kind of an interesting, complex, technical discussion. So we're going to talk about that. We have two presenters today. I'm going to do a little bit of the introduction and end, and then most of the teaching today is going to be done by Eric Romick. My name is John Hay. I work for the University of Nebraska in the Biological Systems Engineering Department. And also with us today is Eric Romick from Ohio State University. And Eric and I are both extension faculty at our respective universities, and both kind of focus on energy statewide. So Eric, go ahead and move me forward there. I'm just going to do a first couple slides in this introduction, and then we're going to let Eric take over. So really, we're going to try to break down define demand charges. We're going to break down those electrical bills. We went through an electric bill last week and looked at the energy charges within that electric bill. We're going to look back at that electric bill and look at the demand charges. And then we're going to, Eric's going to go over some of the case study data that he has collected over the last couple of years. So let's just talk about demand charges. Keep going, Eric, there. When we think about demand, the utility is most interested in that peak moment in time with it when it comes to a demand charge, because they're interested in what you're pulling in power at that one moment in time, and that's going to be measured in either kilowatts, kW, or horsepower. And they're interested in that because they have to design a grid infrastructure system that meets the demand at that peak moment in time. And so we have a lot of, there's a lot of stuff in the news about peak demand times in the summer when everybody's air conditioner is running and maybe having rolling blackouts. They're trying to avoid that. And so by charging you based on that peak, they are trying to recoup costs to be able to have that infrastructure. They also might be trying to influence you and trying to say, if you reduce that peak, you're going to have lower costs. And so that peak demand charge is really important. And it actually gets to be, in many cases, a majority of an electric bill. And so you think about trying to save energy and you say, well, get an efficient lighting or get an efficient pump or something like that. Well, sometimes that doesn't help to reduce as much as you think it will, because you're getting charged a majority of your cost as a demand. In the case of horsepower, I think they're always measuring it in kW, but there are many times you're charging you in horsepower because horsepower is just something that we talk about, and our pumps are rated at it, even though the electrical utility is actually measuring everything in kW, but then they convert it on paper into horsepower, which 1 kW is equal to 1.34 horsepower. Go ahead, Eric. Again, if we're looking at this is a couple, maybe a week's worth of electricity use. If we're thinking about energy, we're looking at the area under the curve. But if we're looking at demand, go ahead and hit the click there. It's going to show we're interested in that peak. That is what you're charged for. And so the reality is, if we could avoid that peak, then our second highest peak is just above 90 over there to the left. But that's that moment in time that we're most interested in, and trying to figure out what's happening at that moment in time. The challenge for the farmer, though, is that we don't necessarily know within our electric bill when that moment in time came. And so avoiding it becomes challenging to understand when that came. Go ahead, Eric. This is the last slide that I'll present, and then I'll turn it over to Eric. But what we're really thinking about here is that Eric and I can talk about this individual rate schedule that we're going to have, an individual electric bill that we're going to talk about, but it is only one unique bill among thousands of electric rates that are approved in the United States of America. And so for every individual farmer, there is, a different electric bill. And so it gets really complex to say that this particular farmer can save, and this particular farmer can save doing this activity or that management practice. And so there's 50,000 different bills. Of that, there's 20,000 that have demands. And I think I want to point out two things about this little chart on the right, is that most farms are going to come in on this blue area. They're going to have a commercial rate structure. A lot of times in Nebraska, that's called a general service rate structure, and that's a commercial type, and many of them have a demand charge of some kind. But note that there's 464 residential rate structures in the United States that have a demand attribute to them. And that number is rising. And that number is rising for a couple of very specific reasons. One is that just utilities are becoming more sophisticated and trying to recoup their costs in a more detailed fashion, but also, and maybe more importantly, they are putting new advanced electric meters on people's homes and businesses, and those advanced meters can measure demand in real time. Those meters can measure the time of day that electricity was used, so they can charge you different rates during the different times of day, and then they can also measure power factor, which is what we're going to talk about next week. I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and he's going to talk about in greater detail what are demand rates and how farmers can begin to reduce their costs.
Thanks, John, and good I guess good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're sitting. So we're going to pick up kind of where we left off last week, where we're really going to dive into the details of a commercial electric bill that we've worked with a farm on, where we have some research data and try and better understand the charges within that bill. And if you recall, like, it gets a little bit complex as you're diving through the different line items, but the point of this exercise is to recognize that, you know, you really have to do a little bit of homework to fully understand how you're charged for electricity. A lot of times we just simply open the envelope and pay the bill at the end of the month. And so taking the time to understand how and why we're charged for electric will help us implement more effective strategies to reduce those costs. And so, again, this is kind of our introduction to the bill. This monthly bill that we were looking at was just over $1,900, and basically 79% of that was based on peak demand. We dove into the details of where the energy charges were last week. Today, we're going to go through these line items and really look at where the demand charges rest within this bill. And so, again, trying to think about and separate kilowatt hours versus kilowatts. And you know, John alluded to this earlier, but with kilowatt hours, we're thinking about everything kind of in this gridded area here. Think about kind of volumetric charges, whereas kilowatt is, we're looking at these peaks and we're thinking more instantaneous. So kind of working through this, there's three major sections in this bill that have charges related to a peak demand. And so we're going to first look at their transmission demand. You can see the total there is $531 related to transmission. So how do they come up with that? In order to do that, again, you have to dive into the actual rate sheet or rate tariff. I kind of have an image of that here on the right. You can see this is actually page 201. So even once you get those rate sheets, you really have to do some reading and some connecting of the dots to determine which charges within there will impact your bill. This customer was on a general service secondary rate, so this GS2. You can see they're charged $5.03 per kW for transmission demand. Now, if we look at our bill, this was off the actual bill. You could see here their metered peak demand for this billing cycle was 105.6 kW. So doing that simple math, 105.6 times $5.03 per kW, you can start to see where that transmission demand charge came from. And as John and I mentioned last week, a lot of times there's rounding errors as you kind of get into some of these charges. So if you see a little bit of a difference there, that's where that's coming from. And again, this is a demand-based fee. So next is the distribution demand. And as you can see here, the total was $981. This is a little bit more complex to kind of work through where that $981 is coming from. But again, if you go to the rate tariff, now we're on page 77. So again, you can see how we have to kind of jump around sometimes to figure out which charges are applying to our rate structure. They're charged $4.16 per kW. This is measured on this farm based on a 30-minute peak demand. So while we're looking at those charts, as John and I were comparing kilowatt hours versus kilowatts and trying to describe, energy versus demand, many times when we think about our peak demand, it's not necessarily an instantaneous peak that we're talking about. While some rates do have an additional charge for those instantaneous peaks, it's not as common. Most of the farm rates that we see are based on either a 15-minute or a 30-minute peak demand window. And so in Ohio, a lot of ours are based on 15-minute demand windows, and within those demand windows are 5-minute intervals. So if you can kind of imagine this 15-minute window rolling through all these 5-minute intervals, the highest 15-minute demand spike over the billing period is what they would classify as setting that demand. So it's kind of important to read how they're calculating these demands, because different utilities have different rules in terms of how they're calculating them. So the next impact to this $981 distribution service is excess KVA demand. And again, you have to really get into the weeds to understand how they're calculating some of these factors. So their monthly KVA demand is going to be measured by your KW, so your max peak demand divided by power factor will give you your apparent power. And then the excess is actually going to be the amount in which that excess demand is the greater of the two. It's either higher than 115% of your measured peak demand or 100 kVA. And so again, there's a lot of kind of back of the envelope math to figure out how these charges are being applied. And then the last charge that impacts this distribution service is off-peak demand. And on this rate sheet, off-peak excess demand is the amount by which the demand created during the off-peak time exceeds the monthly billing demand. And then of course they define what off-peak is as well. So if you kind of pull all that together and do the math, you can see we've itemized it based on the actual peak demand charge, this excess KVA charge, which is going to be impacted by power factor. John will talk a little bit more about that next month, but it's also impacted by peak demand. So there's two sides to that equation. So we included it here as well. And then off-peak demand. Again, two important factors that are on your bill that are going to impact those calculations is that monthly peak demand and your power factor. So the last charge tied to demands on this bill is the deferred asset phase-in rider charge. Again, very few people have any idea what that means, because you don't take the time to open up your rate sheet and go to page 184 and look at the details. I'm most interested in how it's calculated. So here you can see it's a percentage charge. So this deferred asset phase-in rider charge is 7.81% of the customer's base distribution charges. So if we go back to this distribution charge that we just looked at, it says $981. The base is based on these first two factors. And so if you take the 439 and the 155, you come up with $595 of base distribution charges. And that's going to come up with $46.48 for that deferred phase-in rider. So to kind of wrap up this deep dive into the commercial bill and trying to kind of connect the dots between all these different charges that show up. Again, the 30,000 foot view, the big picture takeaway here is, in this instance, you're telling me that a 30-minute spike in usage over the course of that month triggered 79% of my total bill for that month. So of that $1,967, 79% of it was just based on a spike. So again, all of these energy charges that we see here in the shaded area, those are all represented by this 20% of those energy charges. Whereas this instantaneous spike is what's triggering 79% of those demand costs. And so it's really important to kind of understand then both sides of that equation. We talked last week about, in order to effectively implement, farm energy management practices, you have to understand two pieces of the puzzle. That first is understanding how you're charged. So what are the rules of the game? And then the other side of it is to kind of do a dive into your operation and think about how does your farm operate and how does that interact with these charges. So we're going to do that now. We're going to kind of dive into a case study and look at a farm and look at their demand charges and try and understand how the operation of that farm is impacted by these peak demand charges. Just a real quick review. We have a number of partners in Ohio where we've done some peak electric demand or some advanced energy metering. We have 4 dairy farms that we've partnered with. One of them is an OSU farm, and then we have 3 private farms. We also have a couple of grain storage facilities that we're monitoring, really specifically looking at power factor issues there, and then 3 swine operations. A quick review of some of the equipment that we have installed in these farms. We have in the picture here, you can see some current transformers. So this would be a closed loop or a donut transformer, whereas this is a split core current transformer that kind of opens up and you can clamp it around the wires. As you can see in the panel here, we have a set of split core CTs on the main feed coming into this panel. And then we have individual donuts that are monitoring individual operations on that farm. And so with our metering equipment, which is shown here, our energy meters allow us to monitor up to 24 critical motor loads on a single phase farm, or our three phase meters allow us to monitor up to 8 critical motor loads or circuits on that 3-phase farm. And then of course we are collecting that data every several months. We'll go do a download. Our meters are configured to take data points every 5 minutes. So we're able to match that 15-minute rolling demand window. And we have a number of factors that we're collecting data on. So we're getting interval energy, or your kilowatt hours, peak demand, so your kW. We're getting reactive kilovolts, kVARs, power factor. So a lot of good data that we've been able to collect on these sites. For today's case study, we're really going to dive into the details on a dairy farm and kind of look at the overall peak demand. And we're going to start at a high level, kind of looking at annual peak demand, and then really start to focus in on some individual operations and how they impact that. So here's our monthly demand running from April 2019 through March of 2020. And again, this is on this farm, their peak demand was based on a 15-minute rolling window. So again, we're collecting data points every 5 minutes, and there's kind of just this rolling 15-minute window that's looking for what is the highest 15-minute spike in usage over that billing period. And you can see, obviously, a lot of this is seasonal. And so, April through October, we're pretty steady. And then in November, it really drops off, November, December, January, February, before it picks back up then in March. And so, John made the point earlier about, part of the challenge is not fully understanding the problem, right? So we can look at our electric bill and we can see what our peak demand was. And the example we looked at in the previous slides, our demand was 105.6 kW, right? They put that right on the bill. And that's basically what this chart's showing, is what that highest demand would be every month. What that doesn't tell us, though, is what's triggering it, right? We know what the demand is, but we don't necessarily know what's causing it. And so to do that, that's why we have installed these meters, to do a little bit of a deep dive and start to understand what operations are triggering that demand. So this chart is looking at the same time period, and we're monitoring, or I guess we're displaying here as well, the peak demand. But we're doing it in a little different fashion. Instead of having an overall demand for that meter, for that bill, we've broken it down by some of our critical motor loads to see what is our monthly peak demand for these different operations. And as you can see, this purple bar chart here, or bar, is representing the ventilation fan loads. And so I don't know that that's necessarily a surprise, that we'd expect fan loads are really contributing highly to the peak demand on that dairy. Just, I guess, for a little bit of perspective, I should have provided this at the beginning. So this dairy farm that we're collecting the data on is a 300 head dairy. So, pretty good size, average size for a dairy farm in Ohio. Obviously, they continue to get larger and larger, and we do have a couple of those larger farms that we're collecting data on as well. But this is a 300 head operation. And we would expect that ventilation load to kind of lead the way. So also, you can see in red here is our manure pump. The green is represented by a circuit that includes both the well pump motor and also operations over at their feed mill. And then we have milk cooling in yellow. And then the blue would be representing the vacuum pumps, so the milk pumping operations. Excuse me. So what we're going to do is kind of dive into instead of looking at this monthly perspective, we're going to dive into looking at where the highest peak demand occurred, and start to look at it from a weekly and daily perspective. So it's difficult to see here because we list these individual operations, which again, to come up with the total demand, you'd almost have to visualize these as a stacked bar chart. But if we back up one slide, July was the month that we actually set the highest demand over the course of that calendar year. So we're going to take a look at the peak demand profile in July. And so here you can see this is looking at a monthly viewpoint. So we're starting July 1st, ending on July 31st. And this is representing or charting out the 15-minute peak demand readings that we're collecting on that farm. And so, every 15 minutes we're getting a demand. You can see what we're interested in was when did they set that 100 kW demand in the month of July. And you can see here that it was sometime around the 14th, it looks like. So we're going to zoom in from a monthly perspective and really start to look at what's happening at this peak demand event from a weekly perspective. So here we're looking at the week of July 14th through the 20th. And again, trying to track down when we set that highest spike in usage. And with this chart, we're starting to kind of introduce our individual operations as well. So this gray line at the top here is the total demand for the farm. Demonstrated or illustrated below is the individual operations that we're monitoring. And again, we're going to kind of zoom in yet again from this weekly perspective to say, okay, this day on July 15th, something happened that caused us to really set a spike. We want to see what that is. So this is our daily perspective running from 12 a.m. Through 11:15 on the chart, but obviously a 24-hour cycle. And just to kind of walk through before we get into it, I want to kind of highlight the operations. So what we're looking at here would be the daily load profile for ventilation fans on that farm. You can see that in the morning hours, it was cool enough that they were not running. And of course, those stir fans are set based on temperature settings. And so it cooled down enough in July on this evening to have those fans kick off. Then they did kick on, looks like around 6:45. They started to kick on between 6:45, 7:30, and then those fans were running. Down here in blue is, once again, the vacuum pump motors. So you can see kind of milking operations. Looks like they started milking around 3:30 that morning. Wrapped up around 9:45. I'd assume that extra spike is kind of flushing the lines. Then you can see it kicked on yet again. Second round of milking was taking place, looks like around noon. Kicked off, flushed the lines, and then a third milking cycle started, I would say around 6:30, 7 o'clock. And so, again, every farm's going to be different, but what I hope you can gather from looking at some of the details of this farm is to just try and mentally walk through how your farm operates. And I, as John and I are talking, we recognize that not everybody can put in and collect this granular level of data. But we think that there's value to kind of stepping back and looking at your operations and thinking about, what are the different sized motors on your farm? How many motors are there? Where are the largest ones at? When do they run? How long do they run? Why do they run? Is it an essential or non-essential operation? And so hopefully seeing this level of data will help you kind of think through that. And yellow is the milk coolers. So and again, you can kind of see the milk cooling following your vacuum pump profiles or cycles. Green is our feed mill and well pump. And then in red here is our manure pump operations. So just as a reminder, we're trying to kind of track down this 15-minute spike to see, well, what's causing that? And again, the gray line that we see is the total peak demand on that farm. So you really have to visualize all of these other operations kind of in a stacked form to reach that peak. So if you could kind of imagine off this fan load here, we'd start to stack our vacuum pump load on top of that, and then the feed and water load on top of that, and then the milk cooling load, and then finally our manure pump. To see that, okay, in terms of why we set that peak demand, it was kind of the perfect storm where in this 15-minute window, we had all of these operations running pretty much at full capacity. You can see vacuum pumps, feed mill, and feed and well, I should say, milk cooling, and then manure pump. Everything was kind of running during that time sequence. So I think this is a good chart that we could use to really kind of illustrate the concept of essential versus non-essential loads and the potential for behavioral change. So, whether that is behavioral change in the form of conservation, where we just simply don't run an operation, or whether it's behavioral change from the standpoint of let's change how and when we're running an operation. So the first point of that comment that I made is kind of tied back to essential versus non-essential. Now, I recognize that, in a sense, all of these loads are essential, or we wouldn't be running them, right? But what we mean by that is, does it have to happen at that moment in time is what I'm looking at in terms of essential. So from a ventilation standpoint, we have to keep animals cool, right? We can't not ventilate in the summer. So that would be a load that we have, very little opportunity to shift or move to a different time. However, from a pumping standpoint, when we think about the manure pump, that's something that we could run at a different point in time. So if we kind of think about, well, what would it look like if we changed this load profile and moved that manure pump to run at a different time? As we discussed earlier, it was cool enough on this day, anyhow, that those ventilation fans or those stir fans kicked off. It looks like around 3 o'clock, 3:30. And so there was this window of time where we could essentially run that manure pump and mask the peak demand at a different time, because the peak demand of that manure pump is well below the kind of that plateau demand that we're setting here with our ventilation loads. So, this makes a lot of sense when we start to look at and think about load shifting and the potential savings of doing that. But one of the things that's important to keep in mind is, in this example, we've been tracking down kind of this high peak demand point, right? We started looking at it from an annual perspective and said, well, July was when we set the highest demand. And we said, okay, well, why did we set that in July? And we started to track that down through, the weeks and the days and ultimately down to a 15-minute period. But it's important to remember when we're thinking about peak demand that we don't want to simply eliminate one demand and replace it with another, or one demand event and replace it with another. And so I like to try and look at the overall load profile for this farm again. So this is looking at the month, or I'm sorry, the week. No, this is month. This is looking at the month of July. And again, in gray here is the total demand for that farm. And you can see, in general, that demand, that farm likes to operate in a window that I would say is between 55 and 80 kW of demand. So kind of in between these dotted lines is where that farm tends to operate. Sure, there's examples where it operates, well below that. And there's examples where we've set this, demand. This is that demand spike that we just looked at here on the 15th, where we're spiking above that 80 kW. And so my point with this chart is a couple of things. One, if we were to move that manure pump on July 15th, like we just suggested, we would essentially eliminate this demand spike. However, we would replace it in July with one that looks very similar, maybe not quite as high, but outside of that range. And so, again, thinking about how a farm is operating, what this lends itself to is the question: well, what's causing these spikes above this normal operating zone? And so, on the bottom of the chart, what we see in red are the manure pump profiles. And so there's a strong correlation between when we're seeing these demand spikes on the main profile for that farm, again above that 80 kW kind of glass ceiling, I guess you'd think of. But every time we see those spikes, there's a corresponding spike in that same time window from our manure pump. And again, this is in the month of July. So this is just looking at it from a 1 month perspective. But what that tells us is a couple things. Number one, we cannot just achieve the demand savings by looking at one 15-minute window. And number two, the manure pump really seems to be contributing to the overall peak demand spike, in at least in July on this farm. So tracking this down a little bit further, my curiosity was asking, well, this is pretty clear evidence to me that in July, the manure pump is causing this additional demand spike over 80 kW. What about the rest of the time? And so I did some filtering, and bear with me in this chart, I'll kind of walk you through. I did a little bit of filtering based on these 15-minute demand windows. So if you think about, over the course of a year, there's 35,050 15-minute demand windows, or on this chart, I've kind of labeled them events. So where this says event, think of that as a 15-minute demand window or demand event. So again, over the course of the year, over 35,000 of these demand windows. Over 98% of the time, those demand events, so of the 35,050 events, 98.5% of them were less than 80 kW. And again, if we think about that previous slide, we're looking at, okay, what's causing these demand events that are kind of breaking through that glass ceiling? So what this is doing is saying, all right, well, we want to look at the demand events above 80 kW. And you can see I first filtered it by demand events that were above 80 kW. There were 535 of those events. 86% of the time, so 86% of these 535 demand events, the manure pump was on. The other 14% it was off. So I just kind of ratcheted it up a little bit as we filter. So, okay, well, what about 85 kW demands? So if we filter our demand events over the course of the year, there were 283 demand windows in which there was a spike greater than 85 kW. 98% of the time, so 98% of those 283 events, the manure pump was on. And then if we do the same thing for a demand spike over 90 kW, 100% of the time, the manure pump was on. So kind of filtering through this data, this can kind of give you a peace of mind that it's not an isolated occurrence in July that's suggesting there's a manure pump contributing this demand spike. It is in fact something that we need to look at every month. And I would suggest that if we filtered that data the same way, we would find similar results to the last slide, where when we see those demand spikes in that same 15-minute window, we're going to see a manure pump that was on. So we've done a lot of talk and diving into the bill and diving into the data. And so, the question is why? Why are we beating ourselves up over this? Is there a benefit? Is this something that we should really be concerned about? And so the natural question is how much does it cost? At the end of the day, energy efficiency, when we think about farm energy management, that title to me is intentional, because it's more than just energy efficiency. We could have labeled it on farm energy efficiency, but sometimes we could save money without necessarily reducing kilowatt hour usage. And that's one of the things we're suggesting here. So we want to see, does this make dollars and cents for that farm? And again, looking at this July example, we set it the peak at 8:45 on 7/15, and it was 100.21 kW demand. Now, in that 15-minute demand window, the manure pump was contributing 25.03 kW to the overall demand. I kind of lumped together their various demand charges, and you can see that based on $13.85 per kW, so that's going to include the transmission demand charge and the distribution demand charge. It was $347 that 15-minute spike caused. So if we were able to shift that load to run in the evening and not show up during the day when ventilation fans are running, we could potentially save $347 by doing nothing more than running it at a different time. So what does that look like over the course of the year? This chart is kind of comparing the monthly energy cost to run that pump. So how many kilowatt hours did that manure pump run monthly? And at 5.4 cents per kilowatt hour, what was the cost of running it from an energy standpoint? And we're comparing that to what the KW demand would be for that pump as well at $13.85. And so you could see, there's a bit of a range, but kind of ranging from, looks like $319 up to, over $360 per month. It's pretty consistent. When we're setting that demand, it's in this 23 to 26 kW range. And, just overall, the annual demand charges associated with that pump far exceed the annual energy charges. So it's not as though we're really paying for a lot of energy to run it. It's just, it's a large spike in the system. So I think that there's evidence that, we could see some significant cost savings should we, have the ability to reduce that. Now, granted, this is suggesting that, we would be able to achieve these savings, every month. So I'm not suggesting you would save $4,136, because certain months you're just not going to have the potential to shift that load. But certain months you will. And so that's kind of what I wanted to look at in this next slide. So our question was, in that day that we looked at, there was a nice window from, say 3 to 5:30 in the morning when the ventilation fans were off. But many times, during the course of your summer months, when you think of, June, July, August, September, there's going to be evenings where those fans may run 24 hours a day. And so there's not going to be a potential for that load shifting savings. But when we think about, the spring, fall, and winter months, when we look at those months, there does appear to be some significant opportunities for savings. So 8 months out of the year, we found that it was cool enough where the ventilation fans were shutting off pretty much daily, allowing a window of opportunity to run that manure pump. And so we're saying, okay, there's the potential to save, $300 to $360 a month, eight months out of the year. We kind of further filtered to say, okay, so when those fans were off, what's the best time if we need to narrow it down to have these fans set to run? So thinking about some type of a timer that would run them during the evening or the early morning hours, I should say. And what we found was that between 2 and 4 a.m. was really kind of the sweet spot where the vacuum pump load was 93% of the time was less than 1 kW. Milk cooling load, 94% of the time was less than 1 kW. And the feed and water loads were tended to be low during those times as well. And so this time window between 2 and 4 a.m. seemed like a logical time that we could shift that manure pump to, and we would expect that 8 months out of the year, we would see peak demand savings because of that. And so the next question then became, how big of a window do we need? And these almost seem like maybe they're out of order. I should have moved this above this previous bar. But looking at how it previously ran, basically it was manual. So there wasn't like a super consistent timeline, other than it seemed like every couple of days they would flip it on and it would run for anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. But if you kind of averaged it out over the course of the year, basically they're running that manure pump 15 days out of the month for an average of 3 hours. And so we could run it daily and run it for an hour and 45 minutes, and we would get the same overall run time. And then just kind of a closing slide to look at all of the different demand costs on this farm. I know we've really been zeroed in on that manure pump, but again, we think that there's a high correlation of causing that farm to operate outside of its natural kind of plateau in terms of where that demand ceiling is at. And it's a high monthly cost. Now, you might notice that these numbers here for this 15-minute demand for the manure pump, I've had the question asked before. These seem a little bit different than the previous slide that we were showing, where we compared manure pump's demand cost to the manure pump energy cost. The reason for that was the previous slide where we were comparing manure pump energy to manure pump demand was based on the highest monthly peak demand of the manure pump. What this chart is looking at is it's filtering based on when did the facility set its overall demand and how much was the manure pump contributing at that point in time. So that's the difference if you happen to notice that. And then also I did note that the $13.85, it was based on a range of, there was seasonal demand charges applied between 12 and 14. So we kind of took the average. If we think about ventilation loads, obviously they are also really kind of leading the way in terms of demand cost, averaging $514 a month just in peak demand spikes. So that's not accounting for the energy that you're paying to run those fans. This is an example where I do think that energy efficiency has a lot of potential, because those efficiency savings would be achieved by reducing kilowatt hours, but then also reducing peak demand. And that's one of the things that I think our fan manufacturers, I hesitate to say struggle, it's not the right word. So they can accurately estimate what the energy savings would be for some of our high efficiency ventilation fans. But they can't accurately estimate what the demand savings would be, because it's so very dependent on how that operation runs, right? What other functions are taking place on that farm. And so I think when we add the potential for demand savings with the potential for energy savings, it really starts to make some of these high efficiency fans pretty attractive when we look at the potential payback. And we're actually doing a couple of case studies to do a deep dive on that and do a comparison to try and have kind of an accurate economic analysis. But kind of in closing, as we look at these other operations, in comparison to our monthly cost, demand cost allocated to manure pumps and ventilations, the rest of these operations are really low. So when we think of vacuum pump operations, typically around $50, feed and well pump, anywhere from $75 to $130, $135. Milk cooling, same thing, kind of in that $150 range. All other loads, this is going to include, some of the miscellaneous loads that we were not specifically monitoring. So we backed out this category. So we were monitoring the total demand and energy usage on the farm. So by monitoring the main, we were able then to kind of back out the individual loads that we were monitoring and say, okay, this leftover category is other loads. And one of the things to kind of point out that would fall into that category is lighting. And so a lot of times we think about lighting as from an energy efficiency standpoint. We talked last week about how it's with some of the LEDs and the cost anymore, it's kind of a no-brainer. But from a demand standpoint, lighting does not really seem to have a whole lot of impact or contribute to the overall cost all that much. So with that, I'm going to kind of hand it over to John, and I think he's going to wrap up with a couple of slides and lead some questions.
Yeah, it's a good time for questions. Go ahead and type those into the chat. And then if you have a question you want to ask in person, just I'm going to have one more slide here. Go ahead and click over the next one there. I just wanted to kind of chat a little bit about all the different ways that demand charges are sometimes calculated, because I don't want to give you the impression that every utility does it the same. They all do it very differently. So the one that we just see in Nebraska quite a bit is demand charges based on horsepower, not based on kW. But the reality is they are based on kW. They simply have measured the kW with the meter, and then they've converted it on the bill to horsepower. So you might say, well, I have a 50 horsepower irrigation pump, so they're going to charge me for 50 horsepower. No, they're going to measure the peak it drew at any moment in time for the meter, which is that motor plus all the other loads on that, which might be the smaller motors on the rest of the center pivot. And then they're going to have this peak kW in a 15 or 30-minute rolling average. You're going to convert it to horsepower, put it on your bill as horsepower, and then have a cost per horsepower. Now, there is another example of a very unique and I thought confusing way of charging for demand, which was done for irrigation loads in Nebraska. And so that's the second one, where they're charging a certain cost per kilowatt hour. So it's like 12 cents per kilowatt hour for the first 200 kilowatt hours per horsepower. And then after that, 8 cents. I read that and I couldn't figure it out. And I just was, what are they even talking about? Kilowatt hour per kW for the first 200 kilowatt hours per kW or per horsepower. What they're trying to say then is that they're going to measure this maximum horsepower kW. So let's just imagine this is a 100 horsepower peak load. And so they're going to say this 100 horsepower times this 200 kilowatt hours, which is 20,000. So they're going to say for the first 20,000 kilowatt hours of that billing period, which in the case of a Nebraska billing period is a whole irrigation season. So for the first 20,000 kilowatt hours used, those 20 kilowatt hours are going to cost 12 cents. After 20,000 kilowatt hours, all remaining kilowatt hours used are worth 8 cents or cost 8 cents. So in some ways, the reduction in demand in that case would help you save by reducing the number of hours of kilowatt hours charged at that higher rate at 12 cents. So just a different way to do it, but making sure that you understand how you're charged will impact how you calculate it. So if you don't understand, call them. I had to call the utility to figure this one out because I didn't understand it, but just a different, unique way. I still consider a demand charge, even though it's charged per kilowatt hour, because they're using demand to increase the cost. And so demand has an impact.